be using the API. And it also requires a pretty detailed amount of information about the APIs you are using. And you have to represent all of those accesses inside the roles that you develop. And it's not particularly complex, but it is pretty fiddly, especially if you're trying to build a role for a user or a component that you don't know the details of, right? You know that you want to use this application, but you don't actually know all the individual API calls it makes. And so what we have done historically is kind of run an application, see where it fails by looking through logs or the application's logs, and then piecemeal, iteratively build these roles by hand. And that's very tedious. And as any good programmer, I'm very lazy. So I wrote a tool called Audit to RBAC, which takes advantage of the audit log functionality that was added in 1.7 and 1.8 to generate RBAC policies based on the API calls that a user or a component actually makes. And so the name was shamelessly stolen from Audit to Allow for SE Linux. But if you take a look at what I have here, I have a local cluster running with a really simple audit policy, which basically says I want to log metadata about requests from these users. And I don't actually care about seeing the request body, response body. I just want to know like what API calls did they make. And I can look at the audit log here and see these audit events. So I can see that the system admin user tried to list pods. And you can see that that's live. So if I list nodes, then I see an audit event for system admin listing nodes. So that's great. So I'm able to see the API calls that are being made. Now, one of the neat things you can do, if you are a privileged user, you can actually impersonate other users. So I'm going to run a similar call as a user named Bob. And when Bob tries to get pods, Bob is forbidden because he doesn't have a role that lets him do that. But I can see an audit event indicating that Bob tried to list pods. And so this gives the Audit to RBAC tool the information it needs to be able to see what Bob tried to do and craft a policy that would allow that. And so if I switch over to this tab, the inputs that the tool takes, you have to give it the audit log, and you have to tell it what user you want it to generate a role for. So if I run that, feeding it my audit log and telling it to generate a role for Bob, you can see that it creates a role inside the default namespace, which is where I was trying to list pods, that allows getting, listing, and watching pods. Even though I only listed pods, best practices, if you are letting someone list, generally you also let them watch and get individual things that were already included in that list. So there's some heuristics to kind of craft typical roles, and these things would be optional whether you wanted to do that expansion or not. And then it also sets up a role binding to give that role to the user Bob inside that namespace. Now, one of the neat things I can do, I can actually pipe this to kube control apply and load those. And now if I go back and try to do the same thing I just did, it's allowed. Now, there actually aren't any resources there because I accidentally did it in the default namespace instead of the namespace I meant to do it in. So let me just jump over and look at it in this other namespace, and oh, I'm still forbidden because the role that was crafted was a pretty tightly bounded role. It didn't give me permission to look at pods anywhere in the system, just in the namespace where I actually tried to do it. So now that I've tried to do it in some other namespace, that's still not allowed. But if I rerun the Audit to RBAC tool, you'll notice that instead of granting permissions to get pods in the default namespace and in the kube system namespace, it has promoted my permissions up to cluster scoped. The idea being, if you are constrained within a single namespace, typically what you want is to limit them to that particular namespace. But if you're operating across namespaces, frequently it's extrapolating that to say you should have permission in any namespace. And again, this extrapolation is optional. You could generate tightly bounded roles in lots of individual namespaces if you wanted to. But in this case, this is what we want. So now if I load this, this would let Bob get list and watch pods in any namespace. And indeed, you can see that I can now list in this other namespace. Now, where this gets fun is if we set up loops to do these things. So I'm actually going to, start this tool running over and over again, so that it will, as I am using the system, continuously generate this role. And then I will set up another loop which will show me the differences in what's being generated. And then finally, a third loop which will apply them. So if I sit here watching the roles that are getting generated and now just use the system as Bob. So if I try to get secrets, you can see that the secret permission gets added in. And if I try to do that a moment later, because this is getting continuously applied in the background, that's allowed. And this applies to all kinds of things, right? I can look at create permissions, see those come in, and then now that it's been applied, that operation is allowed. Same thing for delete permissions. So this basically lets a program do the work of figuring out what the exact resource name and the exact API group and everything is required to allow the things you're trying to do. All right, so that's what it looks like to do this with interactive users. What about programs, applications, things running on the system? A frequent thing that we have to do is build roles for things running in pods that we don't actually have detailed knowledge of. And so I've put together an example job. So here's a job that is just going to try to make a bunch of kube control calls inside a pod. So get some config, label it, modify it, get some pods, get some nodes, run a couple subjobs. And I've written this so that if any of these fail, it'll just keep retrying that until it succeeds and then proceed. And so I'm going to start this job running. And wait till the pod is running. Okay, great. And now I'm going to just follow the logs. And you can see that it's stuck on the first thing it was trying to do and is getting forbidden. And so I'm going to set up those same loops, only this time I am generating a role for the service account. So in namespace 1, service account 1, that job is running as. And I'm going to set up the same loop to show me differences in what's being generated and the same loop to apply those. And so now we just get to sit back and let this application run and watch the role be generated to let it do what it needs to do. So it's trying to delete a config map. It's trying to create a config map. It's trying to get and then patch and update, which it needs to do in order to label, but you don't need to know that. You just need to know these are the API calls that it requires. It's getting a listing pods. Now it got enlisted pods across a couple namespaces, so it's got a cluster role. Doing the same thing for nodes. By the way, this is the kind of thing that would take me like 2 hours to build a role by hand. So this makes me so happy that I don't have to do this anymore. Creating jobs. Created a couple different jobs, so now it's no longer restricted by name. This gets fun. So it's actually following logs of those, and this gets into how you represent sub-resources in RBAC roles. Again, things that are fiddly, things you could figure out if you wanted to, but now you don't have to. and it's making progress, and eventually it completes, and you can see the role that covers all of the API operations that needed to be done. So that's the demo. If you'd like to follow the repo or download the latest releases, I have more improvements that I'd like to make, but it provides a great starting point for developing your own roles or building roles for applications that aren't yet distributing their own. All right, any questions?
Just that this is a huge time saver, and it's an incredibly creative solution to a tough problem historically. So, really cool.
There was one question about the retrying. So there are a couple ways you can develop this. One is to run the application in the development environment and just give it full permissions. So let it do whatever it wants to do in an environment that you don't care about security-wise. And the audit logs will still record the API calls it made. And so that lets it do whatever it needs to do. And then you can generate a bounded role from the operations, apply that, remove the broad permissions, and then rerun it and test it under that. So there's several different ways you could do this. All right, there are no other questions. Hand it back.
Jordan, thank you so much for a great demo there. That's fantastic. And I echo the fact that this is tremendously useful for an RBAC implementation, which is notoriously thorny to do. So thank you very much for that work. We're going to move on to release updates. Anthony unfortunately could not join us, but I'm the secondary release lead, so I'll run through this real quick. Feature freeze is tomorrow, which means that if you are trying to put some big functionality in 1.9, that should have a reflected issue in the features repo. There's a link in the agenda to that if you want to add that. There is an exception process after the freeze date, but we highly encourage you to not have to use that. But please take a look there and make sure that the work your SIG is delivering is represented. Less than 4 weeks until code freeze, which is on November 22nd. This is a short cycle for this release because of the holidays and KubeCon. And the release team is going to be pretty busy with a lot of other things. So please make sure that you're getting stuff done ahead of code freeze. Again, there's an exception process after that, but we definitely don't want to be getting involved in that because of the timing for KubeCon coming up. So please make sure that you meet that deadline if at all possible. Anthony put in there, there's still plenty of time before the 1.10 code freeze though. So yeah, if you miss the 1.9 bus, don't fear, 1.10 will be rolling out as per usual in March of next year. So 1.8.2 is out. The ETA for 1.8.3 is November 6th. Joe Betts is the patch manager, so if you have something that needs to be cherry-picked back, make sure that you ping Joe, his GitHub ID is JP Betts, to let him know that is necessary. Also, if you have something that you want to make sure that gets into 1.8, make sure it's in the 1.8 milestone, that it is labeled as a cherry-picked candidate, and it doesn't hurt to ping Joe directly. 1.7.9 is out. We don't have an ETA on 1.7.10 yet. We'll definitely update the community when we do. And 1.6.12 was quietly released to meet a 4-week cadence objective. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it means something. So apparently Anthony was wishfully thinking that there are no more bugs left. Let's hope that's true, but I consider that highly skeptical. So, any questions on release updates, release stuff? 1.9, your burning questions, fire away, anything. All right, great. So moving along, SIG updates. SIG contributor experience. Garrett is not confirmed, but let's hope that Garrett is around. I would take that as a no, Garrett. We will reschedule that. I can give a brief update, which is this Contributex is working on finalizing our objectives for the SIG for next quarter. There's a list of objectives in the document. If you go to the bit.ly/sig-contribx document, it has a link to the agenda and the backlog of things that we're working on for 1.9 and 1.10. If you're curious about that, hopefully we'll get a full update from Garrett moving forward. Until that time, Rob Hirschfeld for SIG Cluster Ops.
Okay, thanks. So Cluster Ops was pretty idle over the summer. And then in our last meeting, we had a lot of people show up and express interest in a lot of different topics. So we have an agenda for at least the next 6 meetings, which is going to be focused around going back through demoing various deployment different deployment options, technologies, and approaches. The next meeting, though, is actually about the cluster API. So the lifecycle, cluster lifecycle. SIG is promoting some cluster API work to try and create some standard practice. I'm not the best person to describe it. What I do know is that we're looking for operators to come together next week and discuss the API. So if you were operating a cluster or writing deployment technologies and management technologies around Kubernetes, next week we are going to be discussing common tasks across deployers, so not deployer specific, but cluster management and operations specific next week. So please join in with that. It'll probably become a repeating topic. And then after that, we are going into basically a survey of cluster operation deployment. It won't be the only thing we discuss, but we're looking to, we have at least 3 different demos on that, starting with Kraken K2, the Mesos Kubernetes work, Kubespray, and node emission, so that's 4, all different ways to get clusters up and running. Our demos are long because they're discussion focused. So we want to see a demo and then we want to discuss the speeds and feeds and the whys. If you have a approach to deploying and managing a Kubernetes cluster, please come get on the list. We will give you objective feedback, talk about pros and cons, and sort of work things through. That's what this SIG is for. And then another background topic for us is that because SIG Ops is really, Cluster Ops is really a cross-cutting SIG, we're looking at transitioning to a working group, which means also reviewing and rechartering what the SIG does, potentially finding or changing leadership. So there's a lot on our plate coming up, and really exciting stuff, right? Kubernetes has gotten to a point where cluster operations is a key concern, and we want to keep that front of mind and ensure that it's not a vendor-specific thing, but a community concern. And Jace, I don't know if Jace has proven himself so capable with the other roles. I don't know if you're going to pick up the mantle again, but we'd love to have you back in meetings.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I have more things that I can do than time to do them. I'm sure we all have that. So yeah, I just want to second everything you said, that how important SIG Cluster Ops, and if it eventually is a working group, that this is critical information to get back into the product, so that we can make Kubernetes a better experience for everybody. So thank you for that update. Let's move on to announcements. Aaron, would you like to hop out of the clown car and give the steering committee update?
Sure, in my most colorful clown outfit I could possibly manage. So hi everybody, welcome from the steering committee. I figured it was time to remind everybody that we're still here and we are making progress. So I wanted to just update us on some administrivia. Sorry, I'm looking around to find the bullet points that I wrote for myself in the meeting notes, so you can all follow along if you look at the meeting notes. So we have had 2 meetings thus far, and we sort of have put together what we consider to be minimum viable process. So basically, we have a mailing list. You can mail steering@kubernetes.io, and it will contact everybody on the steering committee. It is this Google group that I have linked, so the steering Google group. Anybody in the public can post to it. Anybody in the public can read it. The idea is we want to be doing as much of our work out in the open as we possibly can. So that's where you get to see, for example, if I can share my screen here. Why not? Let's do this. So we can click through and we can see how I asked if it was cool if I gave an update at the community today, and we came to some consensus on that. And you can see it's basically the same bullet points, and we're like, yeah, maybe it's not a good idea to try suggesting things 40 minutes before the meeting. But sorry, I kind of forgot about this until the last second. You can also see how, for example, Joe is helpfully put together sort of a contributing.md doc in our Kubernetes steering repo. So hang on, sorry, just trying to hide that. So you can see that basically if you come to the repository, we're asking that the main method of engaging with the steering committee is that you email the mailing list so that we can have the discussion out in the open. And we find that it's easier to track stuff in that mailing list as opposed to spread across myriad GitHub issues and pull requests and notifications that many high traffic individuals can't necessarily follow on a day-to-day, let alone week-by-week basis. And we're also sort of trying to spell out the rules of engagement for the steering committee members ourselves. So as much as possible, we intend to try and populate this repository with the documented decisions and use pull requests to do so. All right, stopping my share. Give us some time. We sort of just came to consensus on what minimum viable process is yesterday. So we're taking some time to clean up the docs in the repo to describe everything I'm just sort of saying out loud right now. The first two meetings we had were privately attended and not recorded at all. Our meetings going forward will be held every 2 weeks on Wednesdays. So starting from last Wednesday, the next meeting will be 2 weeks from then. It's going to be attended just by the Bootstrap committee people, but our intention is to publicly to record the meeting and then post it publicly, and do that for every meeting going forward. We will also plan on posting the meeting notes publicly, so give us some time and we'll get the meeting notes from the prior two meetings where we made these decisions out for folks to take a look at. Let's see. So the very first thing that we are working on, as was sort of described during the election process, was that we, yeah, thank you, Jeff. Our next meeting is 11/8. So the first thing we plan on doing is ratifying our charter. So this was the initial Bootstrap charter that was circulated throughout the community and everybody got a chance to comment on. The very first item on our agenda is to make sure that that looks good enough, that we have addressed any of the major controversial concerns, and that we have put in place an amendment process. The thinking here is that we really want to sort of make ourselves real and whole, and ratifying the Bootstrap charter does that. We recognize that it is not perfect. We really do want to improve it and work on that. However, we feel that there are many other pressing concerns that folks are looking to this steering committee to help address. So to that end, we sort of have chosen our top 3 priorities that we think are worth addressing. The most important thing that everybody largely agreed on was the incubation process. And by incubation process, I mean, what does incubation mean? What does getting into incubation mean? What do you get? What are you when you are incubated? Where do you live? What does coming out of incubation mean? What does graduation from incubation mean? What happens if you don't graduate from incubation? Is incubation even necessary? Try to imagine 13 people having 13 different opinions on this topic. And so understand that while we recognize it's incredibly important, it's probably going to take us a little while to pick this apart into discrete, actionable items. But like I said, we have that public mailing list where we would encourage contributions and discussion, and we'll take that into effect, and you can see us have our discussions on this particular topic. The next most important thing we feel is clarifying the code of conduct policy and committee. So we sort of have something loosey-goosey in place that more or less works, but we'd like to add a little more structure to this. So look for us to figure out how to refine what the exact process is and how to put more accountable decision makers in place rather than having to back channel everything. We recognize that code of conduct is an extremely important piece of any healthy open source community. We take this very seriously. And if you have any strong opinions on this, we welcome feedback at the steering mailing list. The final thing, again, it's kind of difficult to break this up into small discrete chunks, is clarifying SIG charters. And by that, I mean, what is a SIG? What are the roles in the SIG? What sort of powers or whatnot does that denote you? What does it mean for a SIG to own a particular piece of code or a particular process or some other abstract part of the project? What are the mechanisms that we use to identify which pieces of the project are not yet owned by SIGs? How do SIGs coordinate and communicate with each other? What's the difference between a SIG and a working group? What's all of the infrastructure and administrivia necessary for SIGs to do what they do? So again, we recognize that there's a lot of need to fill in these gaps and sort of clarify some things, but we feel that clarifying at that level is less important than making sure the Code of Conduct Committee and process is nice and tight and addresses everybody's needs is less important than making sure we clarify what exactly incubation is and means. Does anybody from the steering committee think I missed anything or have anything to add there?
I think one thing, and this was part of the original charter, and I just want to emphasize it also, is that we do want to find ways to get, after sort of the first sort of chunk of business is dealt with, to get the steering committee out of the way and distribute a lot of this decision-making, a lot of this discussion across the wider community. And so some of the sort of important stuff that is in this list is really just point in time. At steady state, we're really hoping that the steering committee won't do that much. It'll take us a long time to get there, though.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In fact, in framing even just those three problems, right, we're always looking at how can we best identify pieces of these all-encompassing problems that can actually be decided today by the existing SIGs and leadership structure that we have. There are only 13 of us. We're all very busy doing other things, so we really want to find ways to make sure that the decisions can be accomplished and spread out in parallel as much as possible and really only escalated to us when strictly necessary. So yeah, we really want to decide our ways out of the problem. Any other questions from the broader community? Okay.
Are there? I had one more meeting. Are there meeting minutes or anything like that publicly available?
So we do have meeting minutes from the past two meetings. Like I said, just give us a little bit of time, and we'll get those posted. So even though we don't have recordings from the past two meetings, we do have meeting minutes from that, and we'll get those shared with the broader community shortly. And then anticipate that for every meeting we have going forward, there will be meeting minutes shared with the community, in addition to recordings of those meetings. Okay, awesome. Just on like a personal note, I can't tell you how excited I am to be working with everybody on the steering committee. It's a bunch of really incredible people, and even though we all have very strong opinions, some of which go in different directions, we all are very interested in seeing this project succeed, and I look forward to us helping better empower the community to drive this project forward. So just a big thanks to everybody who voted and participated in putting this together, and I'm looking forward to serve you all.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the steering committee for your service. This is not an easy thing to make time for, and it is a huge import to the community. So thank you everybody here. I don't see any more announcements. Is there anything anybody else wants to add before we wrap up? Paris, do you want to add anything about the contributor summit or anything, or anybody else?
Sure. Really briefly, members of standing that received lottery forms, this is your last call to put that in for confirmation. That will go out tomorrow. Close of business Pacific time. That's it.
Great. Okay. Oh, Jeff,
I do want to say, I mean, so one of the other things, and it impacts a lot of folks across the community, is that we've been having some really interesting discussions in SIG architecture, and some of this is prioritizing sort of some of the low-level work that is impacting a lot of people, and how do we actually, you know, get to the point where the architecture of the project supports the type of velocity, the type of growth, and the type of interactions that we all want. Brian, I think Brian, are you online? I don't know if you're still around. You said that you were interested in maybe talking a little bit about sort of, you know, keeping some of this stuff top of mind and just sort of beating the drum a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah,
if that's
I'm
something
here.
you want to talk about, or if you're ready.
Yeah, I can talk about this. I'm going to send an email to Kubernetes dev as well. And we've been talking for a long time about the things we need to do to improve the health of the code base and the project. And principally, a lot of it involves making things more modular, making it so the changes don't have to go into Kubernetes master. So we're trying to unblock that. So I'm going to spend some time collecting the various efforts underway and finding out where they are. So I'm probably going to reach out and ask people to provide status on that, so we can kind of create a dashboard for where we are. And it's multiple efforts. There are extension efforts that are underway. There are efforts to move code out of the Kubernetes repository. There's effort to enable feature branches. So I'm going to try to collect the things that are ongoing, and then we can check status here at this meeting on a regular basis. But definitely it is the priority that the health of the code base and the main effort, what some people call core, is top priority for the project at this point, and it will be prioritized over other things. At the moment, just as an example, there are questions about what is the plan for external cloud provider and what we're going to do there. So I think we're going to need to align some of these efforts and put some rough timeframes in place as a stake in the ground, so we can provide some clarity and maybe urgency towards chipping away at some of these issues. At some time next year, in the first half of next year, I would like it to be the case that only whitelisted development activities happen directly against Kubernetes master, and other changes happen either in other repositories or in feature branches. And in particular, cloud provider specific things, I would like to all be out of the tree, except for things which are in APIs which we cannot yet remove. So that anyway, that's the current thinking, reviewing that here. If people haven't taken a look at the new DevStats dashboard, please do. I'm also going to try to get some metrics in the dashboard so that we can actually measure progress on some of these efforts and actually see whether we are making things better or worse in the short term. Almost certainly things will get slowed down in the short term as we make some painful changes. But the hope is that overall development will be unblocked in the future. Is that what you're hoping for, Joe?
Yeah. I think that the TLDR for a lot of folks is that SIG architecture is going to be doing some prioritization and some shining the light on stuff that is really just sort of like paying down some debt and eating the broccoli and doing the stuff that we know we need to do. And so there's going to be an effort to try and sort of focus and shine a light on that.
Yeah.
This sounds reminiscent of during our leadership training, I think we had said no new cloud providers because we wanted to prioritize getting cloud providers out of tree rather than adding in new cloud providers. So I would anticipate we're going to see things of that nature. Where
Yeah, so just an example, we've drawn a line on new volume sources, and now we have to make flex volumes work and the successor to that.
So I
though, because actually I just was talking about the subject of the project, the key vault stores. I don't think we can take that policy until we have a working extension mechanism, right? So in the case of volumes, it's probably okay because flex volume is there and it exists and people can integrate with it. But in the case of like the key management stuff, there is no plugin right now. So it seems like not in the spirit of the project to say, well, you can't add anything new, but by the way, you need extension.
So I was under the impression that the argument was, if you wish to add a new key management thing, you are thus incentivized to help us develop that plugin-based architecture. That allows
Yeah, so I don't want to rat hole on this specific issue here, but yeah, I'm digging into that. Either we will rip out the KMS stuff that has been added, or we will come up with a plan where we take a certain number of cloud provider-based CMSs up to a certain release, and after that we stop taking new ones, and at some point they all have to move to the plugin mechanism. Like I agree, we can't.
Fair to say, hey, you need to invest in the plugin, and the price of getting your KMS provider in is a gentleman's agreement that you're going to invest development resources in developing the plugin. But until the plugin model exists, I don't think we can prevent people from.
Yeah. So this we talked about this very thing during SIG architecture, Brian. I mean Brendan, and I think everybody understands and hears what you're saying and agrees that we can't just sort of arbitrarily cut things off.
Yes, we will come up with something fair and workable. But I think having some kind of rough plan or timeline for what we're doing will help people to be able to buy into whatever the proposed approach is. Yeah. But yes, we would welcome help on the plugin mechanism, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Engineers.
And I think one other thing that we should do is whatever plugin mechanism we build for both cloud providers and KMS and everything else, is why not just wrap up the existing cloud providers into the plugin mechanism? That's the easiest solution in my mind. Is just like.
Well, I don't want to get too deep into those details, but there are a bunch of issues there. Like some of the things are called from the nodes, and some are called from the cluster control plane, and it's kind of a mess right now. So
KMSs are really orthogonal to cloud providers.
I agree.
Yes,
and not designing it here.
Yeah.
Refactorings is always easier on the whiteboard.
I hear it. It's already on my whiteboard.
It's done. Ship it.
Actually, it's in PowerPoint. Honestly, it's in PowerPoint.
Yeah. So the KMS stuff is mostly being discussed in SIGAuth and API machinery to a lesser degree. So get involved there for people who are interested in that specific plugin mechanism.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for the discussion on this. It will be continued in the SIG architecture meetings. I posted the link to those videos. There will be a video posted shortly of today's meeting, and I will make sure that the SIG architecture agenda is updated with that link. Quick, we have a DevStats demo for Contribex.
Yeah, hey, me again. I think that this was something Garrett wanted to show, and Brian mentioning DevStats reminded me, I don't know how many folks in community have seen this lately. So I wanted to share quickly 3 graphs that I found of interest in DevStats. So here's DevStats, devstats.kates.io. It's driven from GitHub events. Just to make sure I'm okay. Yeah, DevStats is incredibly amazing. This is something we have been asking for and begging for a while. Huge, incredible thanks to the CNCF for funding this. Huge, incredible thanks to Lucas, I forget his full name, Lucas for actually developing this, Brian for help pushing forward the definition of many of the metrics. The repo is github.com/cncf/devstats. Issues and pull requests are welcome there. It's the sort of thing you should be capable of running on your own. There are many different dashboards here. What do they all mean? Kind of unclear. Many of them have little things that tell you, roughly speaking, what they are. I wanted to show you 3 of interest to me. The first one is the reviewer's dashboard. I'm going to be focusing just on the Kubernetes repo, just Kubernetes. I'll tell you why in a second here. So what I'm looking at here is the unique number of reviewers who either added an LGTM or an approved comment to a pull request. This shows the growth of that number over the past 2 years. You can see we went roughly from 50 to roughly 200, so that means we doubled the number of reviewers in the project year over year. That is awesome. Good job, everybody. Thank you so much. Next, I'm going to take a look at approvers. And this is why I was looking solely at Kubernetes, because...
Yeah, so sorry, I just want to quickly interject. And one of my hopes is with these graphs, we can assess the impact of some of the tooling changes we make. So for example, in January, we rolled out the owners mechanism. And as part of that, we did literally add, doubled the number of reviewers as part of that process. And we could see the impact after that change. So yeah, we want to be able to, if we make a change, we want to be able to tell, did it make things better? Did it make things worse? Did it matter? So the hope is we can start to assess some of that with these graphs.
100%. Like nothing drives me more bonkers than making decisions and not really knowing what the definition of success is. So this is why I'm just trying to show what the state of today is. So Brian mentioned owners. Owners is where we sort of broke up reviews in Kubernetes into a two-tier system, people who are reviewers, people who are approvers. Approvers have the final say. A pull request cannot get merged until it has both been LGTM'd by a reviewer and approved by an approver. This is I think one source of bottlenecks in the Kubernetes repo is that the number of approvers has not really significantly grown month over month or over the lifetime of the project. Another way of phrasing this is the people who have ownership of pieces of the code base are not doing an effective job of growing and delegating that ownership. And this is something that we as a community should figure out how to address. SIG Contributor Experience is discussing this on sort of a project-wide level. I would encourage individual SIGs to take a look at who they have in their SIG that's an approver and what they could do to sort of reduce the burden on their approvers. We in SIG testing are also discussing the selection of approvers that are assigned to certain PRs, because it seems like we still end up assigning from the same set of really high traffic individuals because we don't have owners files in all of the code base areas, and so the algorithm ends up selecting root people more than it does leaf people. I'm just trying to sort of see discussion ideas we can continue to have in Slack. I don't necessarily want to hash this out here.
Yeah, but that's a really great point. We do actually have a provisional process for adding approvers. If you look at the community membership page in the community repo, if you want to if you want to nominate yourself to become an approver for some part of code, there is a process for that, and I'm sure there are details to iron out. But we need people to actually try the process in order to identify those issues. Are you going to show the time metrics graph as well?
I was going to show this one. I can show time metrics afterwards if you'd like, if you want to speak to that. So this one I just wanted to show as time to first non-author activity. I believe this is across all issues and all pull requests. Now I'm just going to make up a story here. I have no idea if this lines up with reality, but what you're looking at is the amount of time before somebody who's not the author of an issue or a pull request does something to it. You know, applies a label, comments on it, closes it, merges it, whatever. This 15th percentile graph down here, this is like the insiders club, right? This is people who get their pull request or issue looked at in less than an hour. This is cool. This is absolutely okay. These are highly engaged individuals on the project. The median case is anywhere from 4 to 16 hours. Again, this is probably pretty reasonable for an open source project. The 85th percentile case, that's this green line up here, ranges anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks. This is where the impression of Kubernetes being unfriendly to new contributors comes from, is that some people have their issue or their pull request sit here completely stagnant for quite a while. It could be somebody who's just trying to contribute a bug fix. It could be somebody who's trying to scratch an itch. They may not necessarily be interested in climbing the ladder wholesale. They just want to do the greater good like they're used to for other open source projects, and they bounce right off the atmosphere of Kubernetes process. This is where we can have people who don't necessarily know a ton about the code base who are super intimately involved. We can have people do first-line triage, first-line defense, and really help us bring this green line down to something that's more in the day interval rather than the week interval. Okay, and then Brian, you said the time metrics graph. Do you want to speak to this one?
I totally believe your story, by the way, Aaron.
Okay. So I actually haven't spent much time on the time metrics graph.
Can you switch to monthly?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so here you can see the blue, I believe, is the approver time. The overall time to merge did not change radically, positively or negatively. I think there may be a way to also change, this is last 1 year. Yeah, I think you can click on that and select more time.
Yeah, here we go.
Thanks, last 2 years, yeah. So you can see there that the time to get stuff merged did not change radically, positively or negatively when we added approvers, which I guess is not bad, at least. I was hoping that adding more reviewers would actually reduce latency. It did not seem to appreciably reduce latency, but it did not appear to make things radically worse either. I mean, part of the intent of adding approvers was to enable us to be a lot more open with adding reviewers to get more people involved in the process and more people reading the code and ramping up to the point where they could become approvers. So yeah, I think that mentoring process is where we need a lot more deliberate focus so we can get those blue bars down. And if the blue bar is high, either the approver is not being responsive or it's requiring a lot more iteration after the initial review. It would be good to get more data on that. So we'll be looking to figure out how we can get more data.
Yeah, roughly speaking, I think the blue bars now represent the amount of time it takes our CI infrastructure. Approved to merge means the pull request has all the right labels applied. It should be ready to go in, but for whatever reason, it hasn't yet made it there. So this could be a sign that tests are flaky, I think. I think I heard somebody else wanting to share something. Nope.
Yeah, but so that's where, you know, it's important for everybody to look at these graphs and figure out what can we learn from these graphs, what can we not learn, how do we get the data that we need to understand where our bottlenecks are. Like, how many times do tests have to be restarted on a PR after it's been LGTM'd, or how many times do people have to rebase, things like that. We've tried to get data on some of those things in the past, but sometimes it's a little bit tricky. Like, most PRs don't have to rebase, for example, but the ones that do have to rebase a lot of times, right? So figuring out exactly what the right metric is and how to present it sometimes takes a few iterations. These graphs took several iterations to get something that would, you know, at least seemed like they might be useful. So this is intended to be an evolving thing, but we definitely wanted to be able to make it sort of a one-stop shop for, or like a two-stop shop at least, for figuring out what's going on and where we need to improve things.
Absolutely. So if this sort of thing interests, I'm going to put my Garrett hat on. If this sort of thing interests you, please come by the SIG contributor experience meeting, which happens every other Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. This is a key part of our 1.9 goals, is figuring out which of these graphs do we care about and how can we make them move in the correct direction. And yeah, hopefully I didn't steal Garrett's thunder, because like I said, I think he was planning on demoing a couple of this. So this is an incredibly awesome site. Thanks again for everybody putting it down.
All right, thanks so much. So with that, we've got 6 minutes left. Anything that people want to cover before we adjourn? All right, I'm posting before we break here. I just posted 2 links in the chat. One is for the Contribex meeting minutes, which also has a link to recordings, etc., and also the recording of today's SIG architecture if you wanted to hear about the conversation about cloud providers and whatnot. So, all right, everybody, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a week.
Happy Thursday.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.